Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is returning to Canada today after standing side by side with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and other world leaders to mark the second year since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Western show of solidarity happening amid concerns about waning international support for Ukraine and a stalled aid package from the U.S. Meanwhile, Russian forces are intensifying attacks and continue to push west, forcing Ukrainian soldiers to retreat from a village in the Donetsk region.
We all need to recommit ourselves to standing up, not just for Ukraine, but through standing up for Ukraine, to the very principles that make our countries strong and free.
Speaking in Poland following a meeting with that country's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reaffirmed support for Ukraine in their fight against Russia. And while he defended Canada's defense spending, he acknowledged there is more we can do.
There is more to do. The world is changing. It's getting more dangerous. I recognize Poland stepping up significantly in its own military spending, but so will Canada. We will continue to make sure that the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces and the people around the world, our allies who rely on them, will continue to get the equipment and the support they need.
Trudeau's visit to the Polish capital capped off a weekend European trip that also saw him travel to Kiev Saturday to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and other Western leaders to mark 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion. Meanwhile, in France, more than 20 European heads of state and government and other Western officials met today to discuss the war at what French President Emmanuel Macron called a critical juncture. Macron says he wants to discuss strengthening aid for Kiev and ways to give credibility to the fact that Russia cannot win in Ukraine. A top French official said the conference isn't aimed at making new commitments in terms of weapon deliveries and financial assistance, but rather at better coordinating support and ensuring that aid promises are kept. In the United States, the issue of sending more aid remains stalled in Congress. In an interview with CNN's Caitlin Collins this weekend, Zelenskyy says that if the U.S. does not send aid, his country won't have any new success in its fight against Russia.
Success forward will depend on USA. Yes. Not defending line, not only defending line. Because if you defend, just defend, you give possibility Russia, push you. Yes, small steps back, but anyway, we will have these steps back. Small one, but when you step back, you lose people.
U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to meet with top congressional leaders tomorrow as a bill to provide up to $60 billion remains stalled thanks to Speaker of the House, Republican Mike Johnson. He called the bill dead on arrival when it passed in the Senate more than 3 weeks ago. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan calling Johnson out by name this weekend in his push to get the aid passed.
Well, the reality is that Putin gains every day that Ukraine does not get the resources it needs, and Ukraine suffers. And there is a strong bipartisan majority in the House standing ready to pass this bill if it comes to the floor. And that decision rests on the shoulders of one person. And history is watching whether Speaker Johnson will put that bill on the floor.
All of this comes as Russian forces are intensifying attacks and continue to push west, forcing Ukrainian soldiers to retreat from the village of Lastochny. Lastochny lies to the west of Avdiivka, a suburb of the Donetsk city that the Kremlin's forces captured on February 18th after a 4-month battle. The fall of the eastern Ukrainian city was the first significant Russian victory in nearly a year.
Joining us for more on the 2-year mark of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is Jane Boulden, professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. Jane, Prime Minister Trudeau was among a handful of Western leaders who visited Ukraine this past weekend. What do visits like this accomplish, and what does it mean to President Zelenskyy to have them there?
Well, it means a great deal, especially in the current context. Visits like that are a mix of symbolism and practical policy impacts. For Canada's part, for example, one of the things that happened as a result or as part of Trudeau's visit was a signing of an agreement between the two sides, which covers a variety of issues. But the symbolism part is super important for Zelenskyy and the Ukraine at the moment because there is so much of a struggle in terms of getting U.S. support for more funding for everything, really, that Ukraine needs in terms of pushing back against Russia. And so to have Prime Minister Trudeau and European leaders there affirming their support is really useful at this particular time. It doesn't translate necessarily into instant impact on the battlefield, but hopefully it will help translate into greater support from beyond those countries.
In recent weeks, we've seen Zelenskyy more vocal than ever in his pleas for support, particularly from the U.S. How important is this aid for Ukraine, and how costly are any delays?
It's very, very important. Without this aid, it's hard to know how the next phase of the conflict will play out. It's hard to see that Ukraine can be as successful as it has been up until now without this aid. And in fact, we're already seeing that the delays that have been in place getting us this far without U.S. support are having an impact on the battlefield, with Russia making gains not in a huge way, but in an incremental way that hasn't been possible for them up until now. So any further delays are just going to make that a bigger issue for Ukraine, that Russia will be able to push farther. And even if the aid comes in relatively promptly, Ukraine's first move is going to have to be try to get back to where they were in the past month, 2 months, 3 months, when this whole aid crisis emerged. It's one of the downsides, well, that's a funny way to put it, but it is one of the characteristics of a conflict between a really big power, in this case Russia, and a smaller power, is that the bigger power can be pretty poor at what it's doing, but its sheer size is going to have an impact on the conflict. And without that outside support, that David and Goliath, if you like, relationship will play out in favor of the bigger power.
Will there ever be a scenario that sees countries forced to get involved in this war outside of just money and sanctions?
I think it's unlikely for the same reasons it hasn't happened up until now, which is that Russia is a nuclear power. The other states in the region are part of NATO. So anything at all, even small scale, that brings those two sides into conflict significantly raises the prospect of some kind of escalation. And nobody wants to go there. And that's Ukraine's dilemma, right? Is that it knows it's not going to be able to do something or find itself in a situation where the West is going to come in physically on the ground. So, never say never, but I think it's extremely unlikely that we would see a situation where everybody comes in on Ukraine's side. If something like that were to happen, it would probably be not because of Ukraine, but because of some bigger event between the East and West.
Jane, thank you for your insights and for joining us this evening on Trending Now.
Thanks for having me.